Hello, my name is Brian. I'm a sophomore in computer science, and today I'll be discussing the basics of the coding interview. So first is the Pro-Ready Initiative, which is the College of Engineering's commitment to prepare every CU engineering student for career success. All right, so first we will be talking about kind of the purpose of these interviews, the different types, and then we'll go through the basics for each of those types of interviews, as well as what you should do after the interview. So the purpose of a coding interview is to really demonstrate your experience. With programming, it's so broad. One thing that they want to make sure you're able to do is they want to make sure you have the technical skills that you claim to have, and one way they can do that is through the coding interview. It's also another way for them to kind of get to know your thought process and see if you're a culture fit for the company and to see how you perform under pressure because these interviews are super stressful. So it's a really good way for them to see what you're capable of when you're put under that pressure. Yeah. So the first type of interview we'll be talking about is the online coding interview. So typically you'll see the online coding interview for really big companies, your Googles, Amazons, those types of companies, because they have to screen out so many people. It's easier for them to do it like this. They'll have some sort of website that you'll use and it'll have problems for you to complete. Yeah. Um, let's see here. So you usually get to pick what language you use, so choose whatever you are most comfortable with. Occasionally, some companies will force you to use a specific language. You might see this more often in smaller companies that have less flexibility with languages. So how do you prepare? Leak code is a huge one. Go through the problems, do your best, give it your best shot, and then look at the solutions that they have and try and see how you could have worked your way to that solution yourself. Um, you want to try not to brute force these problems. There is almost always a better implementation than what you're able to come up with. So definitely look at the solutions to these problems, um, and research the company beforehand. Some companies are much, much more targeted towards certain types of coding interview questions. So maybe like a mapping company would be really interested in your skills with like graph-based algorithms, but other companies might not care about that skill at all. So definitely do your research on the types of companies or on the types of questions companies will be asking. So during the interview, just kind of take a little bit of time to do some pseudocode. Well, first of all, the format tends to be 3 or 4 coding problems, and it takes about 2 hours. They typically give you 2 hours to complete these problems. So you'll have quite a lot of time to think about your code. And typically you'll have test cases that you can check your code against as well. And they may have, but even though they might provide test cases, it doesn't mean that they're actually showing all of the test cases to you. So don't try and make sure you hit all the test cases they provide and think about any other edge cases because you could potentially get docked points for missing those. Keep in mind the time complexity as you're writing your code. Obviously try and avoid nested loops and that sort of stuff. Yeah, so step one, start out with some code. Step two can be think of the brute force solution because this can be a good stepping stone to kind of understand how the problem works just in general. Um, and then from there, try and optimize it with different data structures and algorithms. Let's see here. And then if you can't, also the nice thing with these interviews is typically you're allowed it is open internet a lot of the time, so you're allowed to look up syntax if it's a language you're less familiar with, or maybe you're working with like C and it's some specific ADT you need to use. Well, then it makes it a little bit easier to look up those documentations. Um, And, if you don't know how to do something just at all, you can also write pseudocode. Yeah, it won't run through the auto grader, but when they look through your code, they will see that. It's also why the comments are super important. It just shows that kind of ability to document your code, explain what you're doing, which is super important, especially for larger companies that have massive code bases and nobody has the time to figure out what you meant by your code. Um, okay, so you're going to want to review their policy. I mentioned that a lot of the times it'll be open internet, but that's not always the case. So make sure you read through what the interview policy is. You do not want to end up losing the job just because you missed, some part of their policy. Yeah, don't look up the answers to problems. If it's open internet, that is a terrible idea. Just look up syntax stuff. Um, and then keep in mind too that just because you don't have a perfect solution doesn't mean that you can't move on. People will get, 50% score and still move on because they have well commented code and good pseudocode. So they're more there to evaluate your logic. They understand that this is a high pressure and difficult situation to be in, and they know if you're writing production code that you would be able to make it because they see how well your comments are lined out and your pseudocode is lined out. I also recommend looking at Cracking the Coding Interview. It's a great book that goes through the process of these coding interviews for different companies. It also outlines some different problems to look into, or different practice problems. Um, Also, keep in mind that a lot of the times what you do in the online interview will carry over to the in-person interview. So sometimes companies will ask you about your logic or about how you felt about the previous problem. So it can be a good idea to save to take pictures or save the problems. That way you can reference them in the next round. Okay, so next is the in-person coding interview. Um, it can be a variety of things. Usually it's quite similar to an online coding interview, except they will provide you typically, this is where you got to make sure you read the instructions. Um, Typically they will provide you with a notepad or a laptop with an IDE on it for you to use. And you'll have to walk through the problem that they give you. They just want to make sure that we'll get into that. Um, Typically, this is more of a second round interview at a larger company is going to be the in-person coding interview, but a lot of smaller or mid-sized companies will jump right into this step because it's a lot more affordable and you don't need to pay for additional infrastructure, especially if you already have recruiters on staff. Um, Reach out to the recruiter if they are vague about what the expectation is. You do not want to be online when the meeting is in person or in person when the meeting is online. Not a good look. Okay. So again, you're going to want to do actually a much deeper dive into the company now because this interview is now much more person to person. So you're going to want to know a lot about the employer. Do your research on Glassdoor, Handshake, the company website, use networking and informational interviewing as well. All these things will demonstrate your interest in the company, which is super helpful, surprisingly helpful for getting the job. Um, Yeah, you're going to want to look at how the company sees itself, what they're most known for, any recent news and why, their big initiatives, anything about the company's culture, about what size company they are, and kind of who the key players are in the company, especially for smaller size companies. This will just give you an edge when you're talking with the recruiter or the interviewer to be able to demonstrate your knowledge and interest in the company. You can also look into interview questions as well. And you want to look at the job posting and review that. That way you can have experiences to mention for any of the qualifications that they require. Okay. So during the interview, it's quite a similar process. It's going to be step by step. You're going to work through it step by step. They typically it'll open with some small talk and a little couple questions about your background with programming. Yeah, and do your best with the behavioral questions. They're quite important, so do not disregard that aspect of the interview. Okay, but moving on to the coding aspect, um, step one is immediately ask questions to the interviewer. You really want to understand the requirements of the problem, and asking questions demonstrates that you're willing to clarify things that confuse you, which is super important because you do not want to be spending 10 hours or a week working on some code and realize that the requirements of the project completely nullify whatever you were working on. Not a good time. So they're looking for that. And this also just helps you understand and gives you a bit more time to process. So the second step is going to be similar to the online coding interview. Start to comment your approach out, maybe write some pseudocode, and this kind of gives you the interviewer a chance to course correct you. A lot of the time, like if you're going down the wrong route and completely missing the point of the problem, the interviewer will probably push you in the right direction. A lot of the times, they're kind of there to help. Obviously, they're not going to do the problem for you, but they can push you in the right direction. Then start to put down some basic code. Generally, it doesn't matter the coding language, but again, some are specific about the language, and you're going to want to do it in that language. You can start with a brute force method to be able to kind of outline a method of solving the problem to the interviewer, but you want to be very clear that you understand that this isn't the most efficient method, and that just kind of demonstrates your knowledge of what you're doing. Um, Yeah, and then from there, keep talking through what you're doing and try and optimize your implementation. Sometimes they may ask questions like if we changed certain parameters, how would that affect the time complexity, or how would that affect your algorithm? They may ask you about edge cases that you haven't addressed, so do your best to address those as well. And again, if you're stuck, the interviewer there is there to kind of push you along in the right direction. So don't hesitate to ask questions about how you should approach the problem. They will appreciate that communication. All right. So the final kind of interview is the system design interview. Here's kind of an example of so typically people struggle with the system design interview the most, because it really requires a broad knowledge. And it can take different forms. So what you see in front of us is kind of more of a typical cloud application. But you may, depending on the job role, get more of a network system. Like when you open up your laptop and you go to YouTube, how does all of that work? Like that could be a form of system design, or if you're working with embedded systems, it might be something like that. So keep in mind what role you're applying to and what type of system they may ask you about. Um, so for example, one question they could ask be, how would you go about coding an app similar to LinkedIn? Quite broad and difficult, but you should start to simplify things down and kind of take the pieces out. So sometimes they will have the questions kind of laid out for you. So maybe they'll go, okay, design a system that's like LinkedIn. What would you do for the database? What would you do for the, I don't know, firewall, so on and so forth. But some will just have you start going and building out something like this here. So it really depends on the recruiter. If they are, well, yeah. Um, So, yeah, on that line, some interviewers prefer if you take the initiative and demonstrate the steps yourself to kind of demonstrate that extra knowledge that you don't need the extra prodding. But some interviewers will want to ask very specific questions and kind of guide you along. If they start asking you questions, I think the best strategy is to start by just working on it. And if they start to ask you a bunch of questions, then just stop and answer their questions and work with them. Okay. So the first thing again is going to be clear. First thing again is going to be clarifying the requirements, making sure you understand the problem. So typically they'll give you some parameters, but there's a couple things that you're basically always going to want to ask about regardless of the system. And that's going to be the scale. The scale is the big one. Storage, network bandwidth, those are all things you have to keep in mind. Another thing you can ask about is like the region. Do you expect it to be accessed outside of the US? Because then you might need additional load balancing or something like that. Um, so yeah, just ask clarifying questions to understand the problem better, identify constraints, trade-offs, kind of really work through your process out loud. Um, yeah, then you're going to want to start to build out the interface. So for example, identify some APIs, some functionality that you'll need. So we've got the post tweet and mark the favorite tweet. Um, yeah, that's kind of the next step for this style. And then you're going to want to define the data modeling. So like the database schema, yeah, again, asking about what sorts of data they want included. You really want to keep things simple, with this whole thing. Like just with the APIs, we only mentioned two APIs. You probably only need, I don't know, two to five to consider. If the recruiter thinks it's bare bones, or if you're worried that it's a bit bare bones, you can ask, is this sufficiently complex system, and go from there. Same deal with the database. You don't need 50 different tables generally. You'll only need three or four. Yeah. Another thing too is like if you're talking about databases, outlining your choice of database could be another useful thing. So why did you choose a NoSQL database? What about a RDBMS? What about a graph-based database? So here is kind of a diagram, high-level diagram of how it should work. Um, so this one's an example of a dating app. Um, start, so start with the user. Think about the APIs you're going to want to have. So we're going to want to have a view feed kind of function here, some sort of analytics going on, matching the user activities, like if they're liking or interacting with other people, uploading the profile, matching. At first you don't need to worry about making it super complex, right? So these yellow boxes here are additional things that we'll fill in later, that aren't entirely necessary to build a basic system, but they may improve the performance of the overall system. Um, yeah. So now you're also going to want to dig deep into a few components. This could be the database. This could be things like load balancing. You want to give different approaches to really demonstrate the breadth of your knowledge and be like, I know I could well, we could use a SQL database because there are a ton of people who know SQL and are familiar with it, but a graph-based database may be 30% faster or something like that. You want to keep in mind the constraints as you're talking about the pros and cons of different approaches. So make sure that you are like demonstrate that you were listening, discuss potential bottlenecks, so things that could really slow down the performance of your code. That could be so for something like a dating app, it might be the database accesses, because you need to have quite a lot of photos being displayed. That takes a lot of network bandwidth, which could be a constraint, could be a bottleneck. And that's where you can use something like caching to keep these photos, make the access a little bit quicker. So here's kind of a fully worked out version. You can see we have additional caching here. We don't have caching for the user upload profile because they only do that activity once. Um, yeah, and then we have kind of by splitting up the database, we can do some more load balancing and really walk through all of that with the recruiter. So there's a ton of practice problems on the internet. The internet is your friend. YouTube is a great resource as well. It, I highly recommend using YouTube for anything you don't understand. Also don't get too stuck on a single approach. Some interviewers are really specific about what they're looking for. So kind of go along with what they want. Yeah. So here's a couple things that you should research. Some good topics to understand. These again are kind of more focused on the software developer side of things. In network systems, it'd be a very different stack of things that you should know. And same deal with embedded systems and so on. But yeah, these are some good starting points that every developer should definitely know. Before the interview, make sure you know where you're going. Make sure you're dressing appropriately. Make sure you arrive a little bit early. That way you don't have any risk of things going wrong. Bring your resume, water bottle, pen, notepad. Probably bring your laptop too, just in case. Yeah. So you'll get a what questions do you have for us? You typically at the end, you want to always ask something. Ideally, ask questions based off the research you have. Uh, so maybe you're aware that they're a startup, a small company. You could lead into a question like, I know so and so company is a small startup, and I'd want to know about how that impacts your culture and values at this company. Or I know that company so and so is interested in merging with you. Where do you see company so and so in a year? What about 5 years? So there's ways you can kind of roll in your research into these questions that'll both demonstrate knowledge and gain you valuable information. So after the interview, you're going to want to do a thank you email. You want to do it within the 24 hours. You want to mention something from the interview, whether that be the coding problem from the small talk. Maybe you guys both like to ski. And then you want to reiterate your interest in the position and the company. This can again be another spot to sneak in some details that you got from your research. Briefly remind them of your qualifications. Clear up any questions. Like, let's say they asked you about holidays over the summer and you weren't really sure about that in the moment. This is a good opportunity to clear those types of things up, or anything else that they inquired about that you didn't have an immediate answer for. And then ask if they didn't discuss next steps with you during the interview. This is a good place to ask and get an idea about the timeline. Some companies have really, really different timelines. Like I know a company I'm interested in doesn't even start considering applications until after December. So, yeah. Some final tips. You're gonna want to engage in small talk, in both the beginning and the end. The informal piece of the interviewing is super important. Especially these days, a lot of what they're looking for is coachability and flexibility and just generally being a decent person. So being able to engage in small talk demonstrates that to other people. Um, Also, you don't need to rush to the answer right away, especially with the behavioral questions. Sometimes they'll ask you some real curveballs, and sometimes that can be to see uh, kind of your thinking process. So don't feel like you need to immediately answer. Don't hesitate to be like, oh, to say, I need a minute to think about this question. That's okay. For virtual interviews, professional background is essential. Clear up your space, keep it simple. Yeah. Um, Again, ask those questions at the end. You want to make sure the company is a good fit for you as well. And practice. Use Leak Code. Look up, try and draw out your own system designs, those types of things. They will help you a lot. And keep in mind that you're not being evaluated just on your answers. They're also seeing how well you'll fit at the company, and demonstrating soft skills. Best ways to contact us are through our live chats or calling us. We do one-on-one appointments through career services, as well as other events. So definitely take a look at our services. We even do mock interviews in those one-on-one sessions, so we are a great resource to utilize. Again, Pro Ready Initiative, and thank you.